Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Christine Kennedy, and on behalf of the Office of Alumni Engagement and the McMaster Children and Youth University, I'd like to thank you for joining this second talk in our Reimagining Childhood lecture series for adults. Tonight, we'll be hearing from a very popular faculty member in our Department of Political Science as he discusses the idea of children as knowledge producers. Before I turn over the mic to Dr. Sandeep Raha, who will be moderating and introducing our speaker this evening, Dr. J. Marshall Beyer, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the land on which this webinar is taking place here on McMaster campus is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant Agreement, Belt Agreement, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and we'll send out a link with the recording in an email early next week. If you would like to activate the closed captioning feature, please click on More. You'll see on the bottom of your screen, there's the Q&A, chat, and the More button. Please click on that, and then you can activate or click Live Transcript, and the closed captioning will come up. If you have any questions for Dr. Beyer or Dr. Raha, please feel free to type it in the Q&A section. We'd ask that if you have any technical issues or webinar-specific questions or something about MCYU, if you put that in the chat, so leave the questions or questions about tonight's topic in the Q&A and just general questions in the chat. That way, Dr. Raha only needs to look in the Q&A section and I'll facilitate any questions that come into the chat area. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening, Dr. Sandeep Raha. Dr. Raha is a biochemist and an associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics here at McMaster. He is also the director of the McMaster Children and Youth University, affectionately known as MCYU around these parts, a community engagement initiative which strives to demonstrate that discovery and creativity can be powerful allies in breaking down the barriers between community, youth, and post-secondary education institutions. This program and the research associated with it has attracted over $2 million in funding from private donations and community organizations. Based on his mentorship expertise and the novelty of the MCYU program, Dr. Raha has been awarded a number of teaching and research awards, and as someone who's worked with Sandy for over 10 years now, I think we've worked together, right, Sandy?
Yeah.
It's no surprise that he's been honored with all of these awards for his outstanding contributions. He is a lovely, lovely gentleman. So thank you, Sandy and Marshall, for joining us this evening. Sandy, I'll turn it over to you. You can introduce Marshall, and then Marshall, you can take it away.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Christine. And I am so glad to have this collaboration with the McMaster alumni. So welcome, everybody. And I am really honored today to be moderating this talk with my close friend and colleague, Marshall Beyer. But before I introduce Marshall, I just want to, in the spirit of the land acknowledgement, I want to apply that land acknowledgement to my own personal experience, especially in the context of the McMaster Children and Youth University. And I've had the great pleasure and honor of sharing, which is central to the philosophy and the indigenous ways of the First Nations. I've had the pleasure of working with children and being able to listen to children and being able to marvel at their creativity and be able to share some of the resources that are at McMaster with these children. And I've seen how much pleasure they get out of this and how much learning that comes for them as well as for us as McMaster staff and faculty. And that has really made me, look at the land acknowledgement in a different way, in the sense that sharing what we have with everyone around us should be really a central practice for us all. And with that, and that is really one of the principal tenets of the McMaster Children and Youth University. And I hope we can all start to appreciate that with time. And so I want to take this opportunity now to introduce Dr. Marshall Bayer. And as I said, he's a friend and a colleague. He is a mentor par excellence. He is a 3M National Teaching Fellow. This is one of Canada's most prestigious teaching awards. His research, which focuses on children and children's rights, has been a core piece of our MCYU philosophy moving forward. But I think the thing that most endears me to Marshall is his involvement in MCYU. He's been part of MCYU from day one. And I have to admit that without his guidance and his friendship and collaboration, many of the achievements of MCYU would not have come to materialize. So it's a great pleasure to be finally giving him a chance to share some of his research with the adult audience, I guess. He's actually presented for the kids a couple of times throughout the course of our almost 13-year history now. But without further ado, I want to take the opportunity to introduce Dr. Marshall Bayer. Go ahead, Marshall.
Well, thank you very much, Christine and Sandy, for the kind words. Thank you both for the words around the land acknowledgement. I won't add much except to say that I share the sentiments of everything that was shared by Sandy there, and also that it's important to remember at all times, but not least when we're talking about the sorts of things I'm going to be talking about tonight, that these have always been lands of teaching and of learning and of research. This has always been a place of knowledge. And so with that, knowledge is the third word in the title there on the slide. I'm actually going to start with the question posed in the second part of the title and then come around to the first bit. And that's because the question is really a rhetorical one. I do think it's childhood that gets in the way of our seeing the important ways in which children are meaningful producers of knowledge. And I think we're all much poorer for it. So I want to challenge some of the usual ideas we have about children and about the dominant understanding of childhood so that we're better positioned to really see what's at stake in taking the first part of the title seriously. And I'd like to begin with a story. Actually, it's two stories. And set side by side, they present us with something of a puzzle. The first is a very good story for children and for Canada and for others around the world. In a way, it's a bit of an odd story because it's a story about international politics that's very much centered on children. And I say that's a bit odd because for most people, children probably don't come to mind immediately when we think about international politics. In fact, my field in the Department of Political Science is international relations, which is the area of political science concerned with international or global politics. And until very recently, nobody in my field thought that there was any reason for folks studying international relations to pay any particular attention to children or to childhood. Now that's beginning to change, and there are now a few folks doing really interesting and important work in this new area, but that, as they say, is another story. The first one of the two stories I want to tell isn't about my field, but it is, as I said, a story set in the world of international politics, and one that actually is about children. This is the story of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, the most widely endorsed human rights covenant in the world in history. Every single country in the world has signed it, and all but one have ratified it. Only the United States has yet to ratify it, though they have signed it, and they actually played a major role in drafting a lot of its provisions, so they're clearly on board too. That's a really incredible record. Again, of all the human rights agreements ever made, none has ever had this level of explicit support. And that tells us something about the importance of this agreement in the eyes of the countries of our world, many of whom can't find their way to agree on a lot of other important things. So just for perspective, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has the support of more countries than the treaties banning the use of chemical and biological weapons, more than the treaty to prohibit the spread of nuclear weapons, more than the international bans on torture and on the use of forced labor, and dozens of others. So With this level of success and support, that's already a pretty good story, but there's more good about it. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is widely regarded as revolutionary. That's a word often used to describe it. And so that makes the incredible extent of support for it all the more impressive, because ideas that break new ground, that are about truly revolutionary kinds of change, these tend to prompt resistance much more easily than support. And that's because they bump up against status quo interests, but also because they don't always sound sensible to a lot of folks who are used to thinking about things in very different ways. So, what was so revolutionary about the convention when it was coming together in the late 1980s? It was the kinds of rights that it laid out as children's rights, and they came in three broad categories. The first two weren't so controversial because they already fit pretty well with deeply entrenched common sense feelings and ideas around what most people in the world could agree we owe to children, or at least no one would have wanted to be seen to disagree. These first two categories covered things that were broadly grouped together as rights of protection and rights of provision. That is, they listed in careful detail the right of all children to be protected from a range of harms, so things like abuse, discrimination, and more. And in equally careful detail, the things that all children have the right to have provided for them: food, shelter, access to healthcare, education, and so forth. The revolutionary bit, though, was the third broad category. This one deals with rights not of protection or provision, but of participation. So what does that mean? Well, the linchpin of this part of the convention is Article 12, which says that all children, regardless of age, have the right to be heard and to be taken seriously on all matters affecting them. That was revolutionary in 1989, and I think it largely remains so today. It doesn't mean that children have a right to get their way on everything, no more than any of the rest of us do. But it does mean that children are to have a voice, and that voice should matter. It means they should have opportunities to contribute to their communities. And here's the part about Canada. Canada signed the convention in May 1990 and ratified it in 1991, accepting an obligation under international law to implement the full sweep of its provisions, covering all the guarantees of protection, provision, and participation. And we made a really big deal about it too, and we still do. It's very much consistent with the image we like to cultivate for ourselves in the world. That is, that Canada is a good international citizen and that we're a strong supporter of human rights for all. So being an early adopter and ratifier on something like the Convention on the Rights of the Child, well, that fits very well with this image, especially when you consider the unprecedented extent of the support that it has internationally. I mean, even countries that wouldn't sign agreements against torture or chemical weapons, even they made a point of getting on side with children's rights. This remarkable degree of consensus on the convention makes it one of the strongest expressions we have in our world of shared values on a global scale. And Canada likes to be on the right side of these kinds of things. Perhaps all the more so when, as in this unique case, there really only is one side. So for more than 3 decades, Canada has been happy to point to its early adoption of the convention in the way that we present ourselves as a country to the world. You'll find government literature on this and websites, and we periodically give reports and make presentations at the United Nations, reiterating our strong support for the convention and for all the rights it outlines as the rights of all children in Canada and beyond. I said it was a pretty good story, and it's one that Canada is pleased to tell. The second story I mentioned is one I can tell much more quickly. This one, unfortunately, is not such a good story, because this one is about how, even while touting its commitment to children's rights, Canada has drawn sharp criticism from the United Nations for its poor record of actually implementing core principles and prescribed practices enshrined in the convention. We got an especially strong rebuke in June 2022 from the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child. That's the body that's charged with tracking and assessing how all countries of the world are doing in terms of their compliance with the obligations they took on when they signed and ratified the convention. In the world of human rights, this June 2022 report was a big deal because it laid out a pretty embarrassing list of areas where Canada was and is failing on children's rights. It even caught the attention of national media in Canada when it was released, which is actually pretty unusual for stories of this kind. It wasn't the first time we'd been admonished either, so it's not like Canada wasn't aware of its failings. The fact is, we'd been called out on them for years, and the 2022 report just continued an established pattern of official criticism of Canada's record. Another recent and embarrassing example is a 2020 report from UNICEF that placed our overall performance on children's rights in the bottom tier of peer countries. So that is as compared with countries with which we generally have a lot in common. Canada ranked 30th out of 38 wealthy countries across a range of measures of children's well-being. Certainly then, this is not the image Canada is keen to project domestically or globally. So how do we make sense of it? And how do we reconcile it with the otherwise very strong avowals of support for children's rights by Canadian governments of all political stripes and from all the major political parties in Canada, all the way back to the 1980s? And in fact, going back decades before that too, because long before there even was a convention on the rights of the child, Canada was always very outspoken internationally about its support for children's rights. This is the puzzle I said emerges from considering these two stories side by side. Two stories about Canada and children's rights that present us with a puzzle because they don't seem to make sense together. And that suggests there must be some missing piece of the puzzle, some problem we haven't identified that would help us understand how these two stories can coexist. I'm going to suggest it's childhood that's actually the problem. More to the point, the dominant understanding of childhood. So when I use the word childhood here, I'm not referring to a time of life, but to what we understand culturally as the social identity of the child. We're all familiar with the ways that that's typically defined. As an ideal, the dominant view of childhood is that it's carefree and innocent, but also marked by incapacity, naivety, sometimes with irrationality thrown into the mix as well. As philosophers of childhood working in the interdisciplinary field of childhood studies have described it, this is the view of childhood as less human beings than human becomes. Some researchers who work in this area call this imagined childhood, for reasons that I'll try to sketch a bit here. First, it is, of course, always understood relative to another social identity we're familiar with, adulthood. In fact, the idea of the adult really only makes any kind of sense because we have the idea of the child and vice versa. We think of children as incomplete versions of what we presume will be the eventual adult. Put another way, we define childhood in terms of what it isn't, of what it lacks, which essentially boils down to a list of strengths, abilities, and competencies we associate with adulthood. And here I'd like to make a further suggestion, which is that this imagined childhood isn't about children per se, as much as it's a set of ideas around how to view children, but also about how many adults are viewed. Think, for example, of how charges of childishness are leveled at adults in everyday life. In politics, that's a very common rhetorical strategy for undermining the authority of voice of political leaders. We see it used as a way to express the alleged incompetence of politicians in editorial cartoons, for instance. We certainly don't have to listen very long to hear it come up in the things politicians say about each other or what political pundits might have to say about them all on cable news. And I'll bet most of us have used it in these very same kinds of ways at times as a way to suggest the same kinds of things about adults we know. Drilling down a bit more deeply, though, the ideas we can distill as imagined childhood have also historically been important to how the social subjugation of women has been made to seem somehow normal and natural. In simplest terms, women have often been understood and treated in very paternalistic terms. Like children, they've been framed as relatively weak, naive, sometimes irrational, and this, historically, has been a framing that's been used to justify limits on their social participation. Women didn't get the vote in Canada until 1918, and even then that didn't apply to all women at the time. In the United States, it wasn't until 1974 that women could legally have a credit card in their own name because they weren't considered competent. And there's no end of other similar examples that I could cite here, both historic and contemporary. Feminists have referred to this as the infantilization of women. That is, taking a view of women as inherently childlike and treating them accordingly. It's bound up, for example, in what we call in contemporary times mansplaining. Imagined childhood has also played an important part in histories of racism and colonialism in the ways that whole nations or peoples have been described as less competent, often explicitly using childhood as a metaphor to legitimize conquering and dominating them. So we actually have quite a lot of experience with separating imagined childhood from children and applying it to adults and to all sorts of contexts of adulthood. What challenges dominant common sense is a little more, though, is separating it from children themselves. Still, a lot of what imagined childhood encodes as a set of ideas really doesn't definitively describe children at all. Some children may live relatively carefree lives, but then so do some adults. This or that child might lack certain competencies, but that's not the same thing as saying they have no assets or abilities at all. And again, no adult has a full measure of all potential abilities. And so we can't really say imagined childhood describes anything about the nature of children because sometimes it turns out not to describe children very well at all. And what I mean by this is that it's not an objective fact that children are by nature naive, at least not in the often condescending ways we tend to understand that. It's also important that we take note that for many young people, life is not carefree. And children aren't devoid of capabilities. They certainly don't have a monopoly on what we might call irrationality, as even I think a cursory look at the daily news these days coming out of the adult world will quickly confirm. Building on all of that, it's important that we think too about the social worlds of children globally. Children live in war zones. They live through natural disasters and in abject poverty. We usually associate those kinds of lived childhoods with far-off places, but many children live very challenging and responsible lives in our midst, too. Canada's child poverty rate, for example, is currently running around 17 or 18%, which works out to about 1.75 million Canadian children living in poverty. And that often entails a lot more responsibility for these children, who have to take on things like childcare of younger siblings, elder care, household duties, and more, especially where parents are absent from the home, sometimes working multiple part-time or gig economy jobs to try to make ends meet. But whether it's in distant places or close to home, a great many children bear responsibilities in the sense of contributing directly to family, community, and country in ways that are indispensable. Children have labored in fields and mines and factories in different times and places. They've done so in places very near to where we all are right now, though more so in the past than today. In many places of the present day world, children continue to work in these and other ways, contributing to local and global economies on which we all depend to greater or lesser extents. More examples. In the world wars, children made all manner of contributions to the war effort on both sides. There were cases of young boys lying about their age to join the fight directly, at times with the tacit support of officials who looked the other way or found some other means to facilitate their enlistment. And that's important too, because when we think about child soldiers, about who they are and what parts of the world we're likely to find them, it doesn't often occur to us to look too close to home. The larger story, though, was that huge numbers of children during both world wars, including Canadian children, stepped into all sorts of supporting roles in places like farms and factories to take up the waged and unwaged work that was vacated by men who were sent off to the front. They were recruited into other efforts that included fundraising for supplies and for essential war materiel, as well as thrift campaigns to reduce home front demands on production. To help with strained food supply, They were organized into so-called garden armies as child garden soldiers in military-style companies under child officers, complete with rank insignia and the whole bit. By the end of the First World War, children accounted for more than 10% of the workforce in France's armaments industry alone, literally making the weapons of war for the fight at the front. And we've seen much the same kinds of things more recently and closer to home, as well as around the world. In the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, Canada's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Theresa Tam, along with the Prime Minister, held a special televised media event just for the children of Canada. What was interesting about this was that the point and the tone of what they addressed to children seemed to drop a lot of the assumptions of imagined childhood, because they made some really significant asks of children, enlisting their help in a moment of civic emergency and in ways that seemed to recognize children as responsible and effectual social actors. Among other things, Dr. Tam suggested that children could keep track of contacts they and their family members had with others, so that in the event of an infection, the spread of the virus could be traced. That's important because public health people have pointed out that what she was asking was that children take responsibility for a part in pandemic surveillance that could potentially be of help to public health officials at a time when they were still working toward better understanding what we were all dealing with. And what's even more interesting about this is that she didn't ask the same of the adults of Canada in her regular briefing and press conference later that day. This wasn't an isolated case either. The Prime Minister also made specific asks of children, as did the leaders of a lot of other countries from around the world, and in the same way, televised special event press conferences for them. Others, from Queen Elizabeth to the Pope, they also weighed in, calling on children to do their part. Among other things, children were asked to think about how they might help make PPE, remember personal protection equipment or protective equipment. I forget the exact acronym now. At a time when masks and other protective gear, though, were in short supply. There were calls to reinstate the model of the school garden armies because of food shortages in many places in the early days of the pandemic. And there were actual efforts in some places to do just that. The Queen even drew a direct parallel to the ways children helped in the Second World War when she made her own call to children to take on more responsibilities in response to the pandemic. Just as has been the case in moments of crisis historically, all manner of officials and authorities not only saw children as capable social actors, but they sought to put them to that use. The fact is, in the grand scheme of human experience, none of this was really all that exceptional. The dominant understanding of childhood is actually a very recent development, historically speaking. We can find some similar ideas working at different points and places throughout history, but in the ways it's understood today, its strongest roots can be traced to Europe, where it really only started to emerge in the 18th century in the thinking of philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose portrait I have on the slide. Over the next 200 years or so, it slowly became more entrenched as a way of seeing children, and by the beginning of the 20th century, it had more or less become common sense. At the same time, through their colonial conquest of much of the rest of the world, Europeans exported this imagined childhood, often by force. And we can see some of the ugly effects and after effects of the violences of that across the whole awful history of, for example, residential schools in Canada, which were founded in part on these views of what constitutes a good or proper childhood. And notice I said proper childhood. I didn't say natural childhood. And I think we can take a really important insight from this history, because if imagined childhood was actually a reflection of the nature of children, it would apply to all times and to all places, and it certainly wouldn't have to be forced on anyone. As some of the examples of children's needed and necessary contributions historically definitely attest, it's never really been fully entrenched in all times and all places anyway. That is, there have been and continue to be many lived childhoods that are not carefree, and even governments know that children are competent and effectual social actors when they're needed. Once again, then, we're reminded that there's nothing natural or inevitable about imagined childhood. But whatever its indeterminacies, as an identity and an idea, a way to describe children, but also those we view as somehow childish or childlike, Childhood matters a lot. It matters very much, not just in schools or playgrounds or the ways we structure family life. It matters when it comes to whose voices we listen to, whose ideas we take more seriously, and whose perhaps less so. And I've touched on this a bit already, and I think we can see from how it's used in politics, for example, that there are times when we know enough about the motives behind its use to be a bit suspicious about how it gets applied to some adults, at least. But we're not quite as good at thinking critically about its application to children, because here it seems to make a lot more sense. And this is where we start to see how it gets in the way of thinking about children as bearers and producers of knowledge, which brings me back around to the first part of the title of the presentation, Children Producing Knowledge. So, why is it more difficult to stretch our thinking about children? Well, because here it's not just about how we understand childhood that matters. In part, it's also because of how we think about knowledge. One thing we can fairly say about children is that they have less experience. Experience is a function of our time in the world, and being newer to the world, children simply have less of it. We equate experience, or tend to, with the accumulation of knowledge. But what is it that we accumulate as knowledge? Sometimes it's not quite as meaningful a thing as we might like to imagine. An illustration of what I mean here, consider the humorous example of a young child, still in the midst of figuring out an awful lot of the kinds of things we adults know so well that we just take them for granted. And in this example, the child, as young children often do, says something that gives us a quick glimpse of something it normally wouldn't ever occur to us to give a second thought. So talking to a neighbor about family plans to go to a cottage in Muskoka for the weekend, she says they'll be going down north to the lake. The neighbor, of course, smiles, thinks it's cute, makes a mental note to share this with the child's parents at some point, knowing that they'd think it's cute too. These are the kinds of little moments of insight we sometimes get into the world of a young person whose inexperience becomes visible in a charming way, but it becomes visible when she says she's going down north, because the world hasn't yet given her any clear clues or indication that north is up and south is down. So there is a bit of knowledge we hold because of our experience. We know that north is up and south is down. And how do we know this? Well, in part because we participate in reproducing that idea in all sorts of everyday ways. We might talk about Santa Claus living up north, or tell people we're going down south for a spring break vacation. Or perhaps we say we're going across the Pacific on a trip to Asia, or we're going to go down under to visit Australia. In all these ways and others, we say something about the top and the bottom of the earth. We both acknowledge the idea that north is up and south is down, and we participate in reproducing that idea in all these and other sorts of everyday ways. But the earth doesn't actually have an up or a down. It's a sphere spinning in space. Space has no up or down, no top or bottom. So there's nothing there to suggest a top or bottom of the earth either. Now, I suppose we could say that it has ends because it spins on an axis, but that still doesn't tell us which end is the top and which one is the bottom. And yet, notice the globe on the slide. Africa looks upside down. It looks upside down because our maps of the world also put north at the top. And in that sense, they also make a quiet but quite unmistakable claim about something we think we know about the world. Never mind the maps, though. That we think there's a top and a bottom is a completely arbitrary idea. It is not an objective truth. And yet it still counts as an important kind of social knowledge. And to test this, just see how difficult it is to violate this arbitrary thing we think we know. Try telling someone you're going down north to a cottage or up south on vacation and see the kinds of looks you get from them. And so if a child were to tell us they're going down north or up south, we might think that's a very childlike way of misunderstanding the world, an amusing reflection of their lack of experience. But are they really misunderstanding the world, or are they actually expressing a different interpretation of it? It's a bit of a stretch, after all, to say someone is misunderstanding something that's completely arbitrary to begin with. Our everyday adult understanding of the top and the bottom of the planet is just an interpretation like the child's, but it's one we're so used to that it doesn't occur to most of us to question it or to imagine a different interpretation. And so it remains an arbitrary bit of social knowledge that we treat as though it were truth or an expression of the world the way it actually is. And this starts to point to how experience is not quite the source of truth or knowledge that our approaches to those with less experience might sometimes suggest it is. Now, I don't mean to suggest that experience isn't important. And the same goes for expertise, which we can think of as having accumulated a lot of experience. Expertise matters. I wouldn't have spent years getting my PhD if I didn't think so. And I wouldn't continue devoting so many weekends to my research if I didn't hope I was producing knowledge that was somehow valuable. But there's a difference between thinking expertise is important and thinking it's enough. And I'll come back to that in just a second, but I want to take a second first to disturb our assumptions about what it even means to be an expert. I just mentioned my PhD. So that's an indication of one kind of expertise. It connotes the years of study that were devoted to specialization in a specific field. In my own work, I spend a lot of time, though, in conversation with other folks in my field at conferences and in workshops. I read the things others publish and others read things I publish. We try to push each other in our thinking to move toward new insights and, we hope, to get toward more and better knowledge in our shared area of expertise. So there's a cooperative dimension to it, too. It's never one person's work by themselves. But those colleagues aren't the only kinds of experts I interact with. In my research, I've learned from government officials, from Indigenous elders and others, because they knew things you don't get just by pursuing a PhD. I spoke to them because they had accumulated experiences I didn't have, and those experiences were important to things I was working on in my research. Now, they were generous with their time and their experience, and I was able to get deeper insights in my own work because of that. None of them were experts in the field, my field of study, but they were all experts relevant to my field of study nonetheless. Put another way, they were all bearers of important knowledge that I could only access by speaking to them. And that's really very similar in terms of the relationships we see here to my interactions with other folks who are in my field. And in both cases, it's an important reminder that producing new knowledge and insights is a collaborative process. And you know what? Lots of researchers, experts in their fields, talk to children in the course of their research. Children are, among other things, experts on their own daily lives and bearers of insight on the basis of their unique experiences and social positionalities. It's an accepted and often essential part of academic knowledge production for researchers to turn to children as research participants for the insider perspective that only they can offer on direct experiences, including the experience of contemporary childhood itself. And the things they know as the foremost experts from the accumulated experiences of their daily lives can intersect a lot of the issues of concern in a range of fields. Their family backgrounds might give rise to some insight of interest to a sociologist. Their personal experiences of the healthcare system might acquaint them with an issue of current concern in fields like nursing or administration. There's probably a great deal we could learn from them about the context in which we think about children's rights if we were to take the time to listen to them, as Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child says we should. So we can also recognize the important senses in which children, too, are bearers of knowledge. Now, admittedly, they are comparatively limited in their overall experience, the experience of the world. So the kinds of expertise that they can offer tends to be along quite specific lines. However, I've also suggested there's a danger in thinking that expertise, even if we value it as we should, that it's enough. It's certainly very important in the sense of having accumulated a lot of knowledge, but being a bearer of knowledge is only a part of what's important to better understanding our world. To make advances, we need to produce new knowledge. And here, children really do have some advantages that the credentialed experts, the PhDs, do not. There's a lot of talk in universities among researchers around the world about the importance of having interdisciplinary conversations. The value of talking to people who work in different fields is that it shakes up some of our habits of thought. When you work in a siloed way, talking only to other folks whose expert training is the same as your own, it's harder to think beyond the field's conventions and habits of thought. And those things shape the way you approach questions in the field. They can be the enemy of the kinds of curiosities and imaginative leaps that lead to new directions in research and ultimately to new knowledge. And so it sometimes takes someone from another field to ask why your field does things the way it does, why you draw the limits you do around what you think are the boundaries of the things you should study, for example. Within a field, people generally aren't as good at asking those kinds of questions because one of the limitations of expertise is that you start to take some things for granted that maybe you shouldn't. Kind of like knowing which end of the earth is up and which one is down. And here's where children bring an advantage that we lose over time, or at least tends to get dulled as we accumulate experience in the world. Children aren't habituated to the presumed boundaries of subject matters, and they don't discount curiosities they may have simply because those curiosities might seem nonsensical or maybe heretical to an expert ear. They ask the heretical questions. They ask them because they don't know they're heretical. And that can work to breach the sometimes arbitrary boundaries that expert knowledge can draw and in which it can become imprisoned over time. Children's questions can and do, and I say they do because we've actually seen this firsthand in the McMaster Children and Youth University. Their questions can and do suggest new insights and ideas from which experts can benefit. And so we can see another way of imagining the kinds of collaborative practices in knowledge production that can emerge in conversations between children and area experts. Each brings something quite valuable to the table. The challenge this raises for adults is whether we can set aside the largely arbitrary knowledge about childhood that we've spent our own lifetimes of experience accumulating. That means recognizing how much imagined childhood has in common with ideas about a planetary top and bottom, because it turns out that in important ways, both might be more arbitrary than real. It means that to discover what children can contribute to knowledge production, we have to continuously check ourselves to ensure we're not letting imagined childhood getting in the way. So let me conclude by trying to find that missing piece of the puzzle that emerges from the two stories about Canada and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. In the criticism Canada has quite rightly taken for its record on children's rights, it's been noted that many children in Canada are not adequately afforded their rights of protection. We have also been called out for the fact that so many Canadian children are living in poverty, so that their rights of provision aren't being met. But where rights of participation are concerned, the extent of the failure is much wider. Article 12 on children's right to be heard has had next to no meaningful implementation in Canada, despite the fact it would arguably be the easiest of the three categories where we could make real progress. We only need to listen. Our governments have failed on that score, as have other institutions. Even the courts in Canada routinely fail this fundamental right of children. In my own research around this, I keep bumping into imagined childhood as the justification that's offered. And there, I think, is the missing piece of the puzzle. It's possible to genuinely care about children's rights and well-being, but still so deeply hold imagined childhood as knowledge taken for granted that some of the very rights they've been promised seem implausible. So, when the McMaster Children and Youth University, in its motto, asks children to question, discover, create, that should also be a reminder to all of us as adults that they can. Baby steps, as they say. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Marshall. I think that that's a wonderful note to conclude your lecture on. And I just want to remind our audience that the question and answer is open for questions. We do have a few questions that were submitted that I'm going to get to and pose. But if people have additional questions, please feel free to type them into the question and answer box. And so I want to start, though, with a question of my own a little bit, reflecting on what you concluded with, Marshall. And you were talking a little bit about some of the heretical questions that children ask. And I'm reminded of, I don't know if you recall, in the very first year that you spoke, you gave a wonderful talk on children's rights and how children can participate in their communities. And a young girl stood up and asked, I think she was about 7, 8, like that. And she asked you point blank, if the government and adults believe in children so much, why don't they allow children to vote? And the audience just went silent with that question. And so, I mean, that certainly speaks to some of the knowledge producing capacity of children, and in terms of challenging our thoughts. So maybe could you sort of bring together a little bit? You've been involved in also other children's programs, and maybe you could reflect on how these kinds of programs can help us to better recognize children as knowledge producers.
Sure. So I'll start where I ended then, with question, discover, create, right? That the McMaster Children and Youth University is a unique model in many ways. It's, as you know, Sandy, got one other in the world that seems to operate on a similar ethos of, being less about the delivery of content and much more emphasizing children's discovery of themselves as bearers and producers of knowledge. There's a program at the University of Hawaii that takes a very similar kind of approach. I think, though, that we need to think about these more broadly than just programs for children, because both MCYU and the program at the University of Hawaii, another thing they have in common is that they both involve families. And so I think by demonstration, they are ways for not only those of us who are involved in the program to continually find reminders of the kinds of contributions young people have the capability and the interest often in making, but also, all of the other adults who participate with them get to see this side as well. And so I think that's really important. I know that some of the stuff that we've done together in the way of research around this points to changing attitudes that come from that sort of thing. And then the last thing I'll say just on that question is, there are a lot of articles of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, but another one that we're failing on is Article 42. And Article 42 is the obligation that all of the convention signatories have undertaken to educate on children's rights. And importantly, not just to educate children on children's rights, but to educate everyone, whole societies, right? And I think that programs like MCYU, I see as a kind of rights education in motion. Because instead of standing up and saying, teaching, here are your rights, it's an experience of them.
Yes, and I'm glad you sort of concluded with that, because that is, just for everybody in the audience, that is one of the intents of this Reimagining Childhood series, because this is where we can have everybody discuss and explore these rights, and as you say so well, experience the issues that surround children's education, children's rights. And so with that, I'm going to jump right into some of the questions that were previously. I'll sort of alternate between the questions that were previously asked and the ones that are showing up now in the Q&A. So this first one comes from Therese, who asks, how do you think children's play contributes to their learning?
Okay, well, I'll preface this by saying this is now getting outside my area of expertise, right? There are fields, dedicated fields of study that work around these kinds of issues that I am only, acquainted with very much on the margins where they intersect a little bit what I do. But I do have a couple of colleagues who work in the growing field of children's geographies in the UK, who have done a ton of firsthand ethnographic research with children in play, right? And learning about the ways they play and the meanings that they make and the kinds of ideas that they test and play with in those contexts as well. And what their research shows, it's really interesting, is what important moments these are for children's exploration of ideas, along lines of what I was getting to at the end, those creative curiosities, right? Those imaginings, those testing different interpretations of things. Play is very important for that. And then there's another area too that I'm not as well acquainted with. I know very, very little about, but it's the world of children's imagination, right? Imaginary friends, imaginary places, all of this sort of stuff. Some children create these elaborate imaginary worlds. They're called paracosms, I believe. And in the paracosm, the child is experimenting with possibilities, right? So it's a way of social learning as well that really doesn't exist. And the little bit I do know about this research traces how it falls off, right, through into our adulthood. As we become socialized as adults, we kind of stop doing much of that kind of stuff, at least in the same ways.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. The little bit I know about that space is also, the concept of play, unstructured play, allows for a lot of what a lot of people call failure and success oriented learning, which is critical, and we know that not being successful, or at least in your mind what's thought to be successful every single time, contributes immensely to learning.
And one of the things that's really interesting too about the research of the two political geographers I mentioned, Sean Carter and Tara Woodyer are their names, is that among the things they've been interested in is what is the effect of militarized toys, right? Explicitly militarized toys. What effect does this have in militarizing children's worldview? And the results are kind of mixed on this. But one of the things that they find from this is that, some militarized ideas are internalized and learned that way. But these are also places where children play out and test their own kinds of resistances to that as well, right? They kind of subvert the narratives.
So I'm going to jump right to the next question. This is from Rob in the Q&A, and he's sort of following up on our initial discussion and asks your opinion on whether children will ever be able to vote in elections, and how might this be reasonably implemented?
Okay. That's one of those fix the world questions, and I would like to. I guess, I think what I would say is that there was a time when women voting sounded outlandish, right? It seemed impossible, and yet, right? So there's still an awful lot of work to be done, obviously, on women's rights. Feminist projects still need to go a long way, and we still have a lot of problems around gender in our society. But the vote is pretty much unquestioned. And it's interesting to look at the arguments against children's voting because they sound exactly like the arguments that were made against women's voting. They're not capable. They'll vote for silly things, right? The thing that's always said about children is, oh, well, they'll vote for candy. To which I respond, think of some recent elections and the promises that were made and the things people voted for, right? I think buck a beer is probably the adult equivalent of children voting for candy. So there are ways that people have thought about doing this. Some jurisdictions have talked about reducing the voting age. Some have talked about getting rid of it altogether, right? Not all children will want to vote, but those who do, maybe they'll go and vote. And the point that's made is, oh, but they won't be as well informed. Well, we know that the adult electorate an awful lot of them are very uninformed as well. And yet that doesn't call into question their right to vote. So, maybe if children had the vote, I wonder what kinds of issues our politicians might be forced to take more seriously, especially, where sometimes getting government or not can be kind of a marginal pass. Maybe things like climate change, for instance, would move up the agenda because these are things that younger people tend to be more concerned about relative to older people. So I think it could change our political landscape. But again, the arguments against it don't really stand up very well on their own terms.
And, I think just following up on that, there's another question in the Q&A from someone with the initials DBE. And that asks, do you think reserving a portion of the Canadian Senate for children is a good idea?
So here I'm going to plead my ignorance a little bit too, because I am not a Canadianist. I'm not an institutionalist kind of political scientist. So I have colleagues who understand the implications of these kinds of things far better than I do. My inclination always, though, is more participation is better. If we're going to have it, I mean, again, I'd throw it back the same way and say, should women be in the Senate?
Yeah.
And that's one that usually kind of strikes home for people when we put it that way, because you can look again historically and see the parallels between the exclusion of women and the exclusion of children.
So there are a number of questions around the learning experience for children. So I'm just going to cluster them together, maybe, Marshall, and ask you a series of questions around that. And this question comes from Samuel, who asks, what is the best approach for learning experiences for children? I think what the meaning here is, what is the best approach to structure learning experiences for children?
Yeah. So once again, I'm in danger of getting outside of my area here because I education. I mean, I teach, but I haven't been trained in a faculty of education. So my feeling, though, is that Article 12 still holds, right? The right to voice, the right to participate. And I think that certainly, now this isn't dealing with children, but certainly in my own teaching in the university and where I have interacted with children through programs like MCYU, I think anything that becomes conversational and where people's views and ideas are taken seriously. The tricky thing here is you invite young people or you invite, university students to take chances. And there's a risk in that. And so I always think about what you say, Sandy, about how in your laboratory that an experiment that leads to nothing isn't a loss, because until you did it, you didn't know that there was a dead end down that path. And so that is actually useful new knowledge. And so I think that's something we need to be teaching at the same time, not just about content, but how to relate to knowledge and knowledge production. And that means that, not every idea is going to fly, but it doesn't mean we don't learn from something from playing with it, just like children experimenting with scenarios in paracosms or in play.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that in collaboration with you, we've developed in our ethos in terms of structuring learning experiences is to listen to the kids. Let's let the kids inform us of what they want, because that's a great starting point for engagement. And so, that is part of what we do at MCYU. Another question, again, around the play issue. And, we can summarize a little bit more quickly too, Marshall, if you feel that this has already been discussed, but I do want to make sure that everyone's questions are touched upon. So Rolf asks, what is the role of play and play deprivation in the development of a child into a well-rounded adult?
Yeah, I mean, again, I can only point to literatures that aren't my area, but everything that I have ever been able to take from them underscores again and again the importance of it. Right? It's a part of social development, and there is a whole field out there that looks at play. Adults still play, and there's still a social and meaning making importance to all of that. It has different kinds of developmental implications, but partly because it takes place in a much larger field of experience. So I think that there's never a time probably when it's not important. But again, the literature that I've looked at outside of my area of expertise continually points to the imperative nature of it for young people.
So this is kind of an interesting question. It comes from Allison. She asks, in what ways can we balance encouraging our kids to be confident in sharing knowledge while also remaining teachable?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, I think part of it goes back to what we were just talking about a moment ago. I think one of the first lessons is that most every idea is worth considering, but not every idea is equal. And so I think we get invested, certainly I did in the way I was socialized through education as a child. We get invested in the idea of a right or wrong answer, and it's good to be right and it's bad to be wrong. And there are social consequences to that too, right? No one wants to look or sound stupid. And I think that does a lot of damage, that we can't play with ideas, still have to take responsibility for them, right? Again, not every idea flies and they aren't all equal. Some ideas are really profoundly bad ideas, but they are part of the learning process in engaging them. And I think that the first lesson, and it's not one that you just teach and move on from, it has to be a thread that continues throughout our learning lives, is that it's okay to say something that sounds silly, right? That's a part of the process. If I was judged on every draft of a paper I ever wrote, instead of the ones that actually got published eventually, I'd be awfully embarrassed. But that process was so important to getting to the paper eventually.
Absolutely. And, we've talked a little bit about it, and I've told you the stories. When I first proposed the idea of MCYU to my colleagues, many thought it was silly. And through discussions and trial and error did we come up with our current model. And so, totally in agreement with what you're talking about there. Here's one that is in your area of expertise, which is Aaron asks, what are other countries doing well to address the rights of participation for children?
So there are movements in some countries in Northern Europe. There have also been moves in California on the state level to lower the voting age in some cases, or to try to figure out schemes whereby children can have more input. There are so-called children's parliaments that have been implemented in some places. They're sort of a mixed bag, right? Sometimes they have more of a club feel to them than dealing with anything really substantive. But where they're taken seriously, they're a kind of input. There are schemes about starting to vote very early, but having sort of a graduated, your vote gets worth more and more as you go. Those all have their limitations too. I mentioned the courts are conspicuous failures on this because, you'd think the courts, right? If anyone could implement children's rights, but on matters involving children, their right to be heard, whether it's wills and estates or family law or civil matters, often is simply ignored. Sometimes they don't even know proceedings are going on about them in Canada. In other countries, in France, they have a right to be present at everything. In some other countries, New Zealand is quite good on this. Some countries are better, some are worse. Like the British Isles are a bit of a mixed bag, even within the United Kingdom. the different like England, Scotland, Wales, all sort of get some things right better than some others. And so that bit on voice is a tough one. And I think that ultimately it's this idea, oh, but they're just children, that we fall back into that. And that's why I went very briefly through a little bit of the history going back to the 18th century in Europe, because for most of human history, including, great civilizations, children were not human becomings. They were important functioning members of society. In some ways, they've been badly exploited, but in some ways in our own world, they're being badly exploited. So, that's not the argument either for their social exclusion.
Yeah. I think that's, if people look back in history, that's certainly clear. This next question comes to us from an anonymous attendee who asks, can you speak to the role of educators in both fostering and in not hindering childhood knowledge production?
Yeah, this comes down to teaching styles. So in the scholarship on teaching and learning, there's a whole area known as critical pedagogy that looks at, among other things, trying to recover children's voice and agency as participants in their education. So it's a much more dialogical, so a dialogue approach to education as opposed to monological. The monologue, the sage on the stage, the teacher at the front of the room, the desks neatly aligned facing forward, and the students are there as sponges to internalize rather than to interact. And I think it's the latter model that all of the scholarship on teaching and learning, and this I have read a fair bit of, points to the latter model being far more effective across a whole range of indicators, including citizenship.
Yeah. Yeah, and if there are teachers in the audience, I can share that part of what we do at MCYU to work with educators is to deploy to classrooms and really provide those opportunities, as Marshall was saying, for that bi-directional conversation. We allow the teachers to introduce and they deliver the curricular content, and then we work with the teachers and the kids to demonstrate application, and that is done through creative hands-on activities, which I think collaboratively facilitates that knowledge creation in conjunction with the curricular material that the teachers are provincially required to deliver. And so it's been a good alliance, I think, and it's a good model that works to fit what you were just saying.
And I think something important to add there too is that resources are a factor.
Yeah.
Because what we know are these more effective models are also really resource intensive. They don't work as well with huge groups because they're simply harder to manage. One of the things I just said was the sage on the stage model, right? Where one person, we see this all over the university, Sandy, right? I have large lectures that I teach where I stand at a lectern at the front of the room and 100 or 200 people sit and take notes. There's no dialogue going on because to teach to those kind of numbers, that's the way that particular course is structured. But even more, the physical space is structured for that. The acoustics in the room are designed so that only one person can be heard, and only one person is facing all the others who aren't facing one another. So there are a lot of things that it's easy to sit and say, oh, it should be this dialogical model. It's not always quite that simple, right? There needs to be some social buy-in on that as well.
Absolutely. We have another question from anonymous attendee. The question is, Dr. Beyer, in what ways do you recommend for parents to encourage and empower our little ones to have confidence in their own knowledge and beliefs when society still bombards them with the box of perceived or imagined childhood? That is a lecture in itself.
Yeah, it's more than a lecture. It's an answer I'm searching for. So my daughter's 21, and for the last 21 years, it is something I have wondered about a lot and tried to do my best. I mean, I think it's a resource question again, right? Because it takes a lot of investment of parents' time. talking with children. Now, I am not an expert in early childhood development, so I want to be clear about that. And my little experiment with a count of one probably isn't a good sample size. But whether I got it right or got it wrong, one of the rules I set for myself was I wasn't going to do it. And it was partly because it was something that just always aggravated me when I heard it from teachers or other from adults in my life, because I said so. Right. So, in the moment, don't run into the street. You can't stop to give an explanation when the car is coming. Sometimes you have to sort of be that authoritarian in the moment. But I tried. I don't know that I always did it well, but I tried to make myself accountable later to give an explanation for these things. And I think that, none of us want to be just told to do something without having a sense of why. And I think that extends to learning.
Yeah. No, I think that's very true. And sort of in that direction, I have a question from Alex that says that asks, let's see, what relationships do you see between children's activism or the necessity for such and participation and their right to participate?
So here I'll defer to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because Article 12 says that children have the right to be heard. Articles 12 and 13 say that they have the right to freedom of expression and the right to freedom of thought. So Article 12, the right to be heard, presumes you have something to say, right? There's a contribution to make. And Articles 12 and 13 create more space for that and try to protect the space in which young people can develop their own perspectives on things, but also express them. And so, again, it's a huge question and a tall order, but I think that imagined childhood is what is getting in our way again.
Yeah, no, totally. Another question from Rob says, can you say a little bit more about why the US has not ratified the convention? Is it something specific to the convention or more of a broader UN related issue?
Yeah, I don't think it's a UN related issue. I think it's a matter of US domestic politics. I think in that case, it's parental rights colliding with children's rights. And there's a very strong current of that. And just the way that coalitions get built, with the way they rise and fall in American politics, it's on those kinds of things that governments can also rise and fall. And so it just hasn't been something that it's been possible for them to ratify. That said, I have argued that, so I won't go into in great detail, but there's a thing in international law called the customary norm, which means that the fact that you didn't sign it doesn't mean you're not bound by it. And the arbiters of whether or not you're bound by it are, have you accepted its central validity principles, right? Or central validity claims. So the central validity claim of the prohibition on torture is it's not good to torture people. So countries that don't sign that ban, but do make public statements about, of course, we would never torture. Well, they're acknowledging that torture is bad. And because so many countries have signed it, a customary norm of international law means it's binding on them anyway. Well, the US has signed it. They just haven't ratified it. They played a major role in drafting a lot of its provisions. They speak about children's rights. There's literally no argument that there isn't big buy-in from the rest of the world. So every single criterion of a customary norm is met. So I would argue that they're bound by it without ratifying it. Sandy,
Hang on, sorry, my phone was ringing. I had to turn the mic off. I apologize to everyone. So there are a lot of questions. I'm going to just give you one more, and maybe we'll wrap up after that. This one comes from Reina, who says, are there existing models or frameworks that pediatricians can adopt to better capture and utilize children's knowledge and clinical practice? I don't know if you know of anything. This is a very interesting question.
I do not know of anything. That's definitely that's Sandy. You're into pediatrics, not me. So that's definitely outside of my area. However, I just heard from someone in your department the other day, Sandy, Hassan, who has just published a book on what children know.
Yes, yeah.
And so I think I would refer that question to him.
Yeah.
Because he's someone who I think has thought about these kinds of things in ways I just haven't. And also has the background expertise that I don't.
Yeah, he actually did talk about that. I remember at a departmental meeting where he said, on a pat leave, paternity leave, with a new baby, he sat and listened to his baby sort of coo and coddle and thought about this question about listening to kids, and I thought it was phenomenal. And he was able to turn that into a book. And I think one of the key messages I got from just listening to him talk is that he actually listened and reflected, which sometimes I'll have to admit, like, when my kids were little and in the context of our overburdened healthcare, there's sometimes not the time to listen for a physician. And I think there's certainly a lot of training in that I know. I mean, I'm not a clinician, so I don't know all the ins and outs, and I hope I'm not offending any clinicians on the call if they're there. But I know there's a genuine intent to listen, but the system doesn't actually give you that scope. And so I think when you can, the weighing of the words of children, and I think I've heard that echoed in your talk today, is really critical.
So if I can just give Hassan's book a plug then, because I was just looking on my phone to find the name of it. Get this, it's published today.
Yeah, there you go.
So this is perfect. It's entitled Sleep Well, Take Risks, Squish the Peas. And the subtitle, or the secondary title, is Secrets from the Science of Toddlers for a happier, more successful way of life. So there's someone who's really thought about this.
There you go.
I look forward to reading the book.
And that's a wonderful note and a happy note to end on. And I do apologize to the people whose questions that we did not get to, but there are just so many questions in the Q&A, and there's a lot of accolades to you, Marshall. Thanking you for your wonderful talk and your wonderful answers. So with that, I will wrap up this evening's session and remind our audience to please visit our website at mcyu.ca, where you can learn more about all the activities that go on. And I would also encourage you to consider donating to MCYU because we do operate on donations, and that is a critical piece of our infrastructure requirement. So thank you everyone for attending, and I thank the Alumni Association for helping us to put on these events. And Christine, I'll turn it back over to you and wish everybody a good evening.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandy and Marshall. That was wonderful. I know I certainly learned a lot, trying to keep my curiosity just like children do, like an open mind. So thank you, everyone. As we mentioned, this is an ongoing series. We just started it in the fall. This is our second lecture. The idea is we'll do one a semester. So please, if you enjoyed this talk, feel free to, you'll be getting a survey once you come out of the Zoom. And if you have any ideas on Reimagining Childhood that you'd like us to investigate, we'd be certainly happy to hear from you and get your feedback. We'll have another lecture in the fall and another one in the winter again. So look forward to that in your inbox. So thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Marshall and Sandy. And we look forward to having everyone join another webinar in the future. Thanks everyone. Take care.
Good night,
Thank you
everyone.
everyone.